Welcome back, everybody, to me trashing Mark Lawrence. Well, not really. I'm going to talk about the Broken Empire series by Mark Lawrence today, and I'll try to do this with like a larger and greater context around it, and that's sort of what we're going to do today. And this will be a full spoiler discussion, well, of the Broken Empire trilogy, that being the Prince of Thorns, the King of Thorns, and the Emperor of Thorns. And I guess we can just all be really happy that it ended there and we don't have Demigod of Thorns and stuff like that as well. But there we are, 3 books, they've been around for like a decade. I think it's time to re-evaluate them and see what it can teach us about gritty, grim, dark fantasy of the first decade of this century, right? Let's do that. Cheers. Alright, I'll try to structure this and try to embed it into a larger context to explain why I think the Broken Empire trilogy does work wonderfully as an example for a lot of the failings and issues of the beginnings of our current era of grim, dark fantasy, by which I mean stuff like the First Law trilogy, the first one, The Gentleman Bastards, well, at least, the Lies of Locke Lamora, although that is, not as grim and dark as some of the other stuff, but I feel it's sort of the same era of fantasy, and there's reasons why I try to compare those. I might drag in Richard K. Morgan and his Land Fit for Heroes, but I'm not quite sure yet, because, I'm making this stuff up, and this is my second and a half attempt to actually do this, so we'll see. Let's start with the Broken Empire trilogy by Mark Lawrence. Alright, so, came out in 2012, 11, 12, 13, something like that. Well, I mean 2012, 12, and 13 or 14, roughly a decade ago. It's a fairly short for epic fantasy trilogy of books that follow mostly the misadventures of Prince Honorus Jorg Ankrath, and they are largely told as a first-person narrative by Prince Honorus Jorg Ankrath. There are later on some diary excerpts in book 2 of a second character, and there's an actual third person, limited though narrative of another character in book 3. And they basically take place in a post-apocalyptic Europe that has reverted to the Middle Age, to a very medieval style of things. And they are very dark, to say, brutal, ultra-violent, so to speak. And they were kind of divisive at the time, I guess. There's a long article on what's wrong with it that I'll post down below in the description if you feel like having a detailed analysis on why the treatment of race and the treatment of gender in the first book is not exactly as good as it could be. I really recommend reading it. It ties the whole thing into gamer culture in a way where I think it could have been a stronger article, but wait, once again, this is, if you want to understand that old debate of grimdark that I alluded to before, if you want to understand that some more, this is certainly another article from that old debate, decade-old debate, that I feel is interesting at least, and tells us a lot about the genre of fantasy and how we talk about it. So yeah, let's go and talk about my issues with the whole trilogy, and then I'll do the context thing. World building. The world building in the Broken Empire trilogy is not good. And there's a bunch of reasons why that is the case. As I said, I will not go too deeply into the racism inherent in it. There's this article. I'll just give you a bunch of points here, and then we'll talk about other stuff. So let's start. This is a far future version of the world focused on Europe, mostly Western Europe, around, I guess, France and parts of Germany and parts of England. And the conceit is that after the Day of the Thousand Suns, a nuclear holocaust, the world reverted to a more or less medieval style of thing, or has slowly crept its way up again to that state. We don't really know. There was an empire, and this empire, which is sort of modeled on, I guess, sort of more or less either the Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire in the German version that you have in the Middle Ages, which makes more sense, and that fell with the death of the last emperor, and now you have 100 kingdoms and petty earls and whatnot that are all trying to become emperor again. There's a congress where they all meet and then they elect a new emperor, and for the last couple of centuries no one has reached the necessary majority. That's our backdrop. Now there's a bunch of things with this, and there's like one big conceit that I think is really important to explain why I think there's an issue with the world building, because it's a really good part. The idea why magic suddenly works in this setting is that in our far future, a high-tech thing happened, and humanity fucked around with quantum mechanics and have made things more possible by willpower, which is how magic comes in there. And now at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. We don't have like an actual magic system or anything like that, but we do know that that's sort of like the techie explanation on why magic works, which kind of comes back to that whole Arthur C. Clarke quote about like any sufficiently advanced technology appearing to be magic. And I'm fine with that. That's a really cool idea, because the idea is that they started like a runaway process that is getting worse and worse and will finally destroy our universe. Great setup. Unfortunately, a lot of things don't really add up and don't go anywhere with this. It kind of is something that we learn about in like a last book, no, in the second to last book, I think, but mostly in the last book, to set up like that final release of the whole story. But before that, we need to talk about a bunch of ideas that are sort of weird. And that is, why would humanity revert to a clear copy of medieval Europe afterwards? And that's sort of what we have. It's like we have kingdoms that are named roughly after medieval kingdoms. That are, you know, in Spain down we have like Aragon and Catalan and whatnot. So we have all of these ideas that are very, very medieval. And we have a very racially pure or ethnically pure Europe. Like everyone's white, everyone has like sort of works in those ways. And the question there is, why is that the case? And Mark Lawrence doesn't give us an actual answer for that. And that's one of the issues that I have here. It's a very much a missed chance, because you could do a lot of fun things with this, right? You could go like, yeah, you know what? They aren't actual Europeans. They live there, but because of, you know, crawling back after that whole like Fallout situation, all they found were like really old manuscripts and shit. So they adopted the stuff and the worldview they found in those old books, which would be supported by the things that, by one of the aspects that like people are always reading classics, like Greek classics and medieval classics and stuff like that. That would work perfectly, and you can make like even like a point about like how that is all like a construction, and have like reveal that like a lot of people say in the Teuton lands, the Teutonic lands, so to speak, are in fact, you know, ethnically diverse as fuck, but they just like think of themselves as Teutons because that's sort of like the image or like the identity they took on after, you know, rebuilding out of nowhere. That would be really cool. But instead we have like ethnically pure Teutons that are all blonde. We have ethnically pure like Vikings, for whatever reason. Why you would call them Vikings, no one really knows. We have ethnically pure Danes that are all like white blonde hair and long beards and axes and stuff. We have like the cliche of medieval Europe. But it is set in our world, which makes it's kind of weird, because you need to explain how a already ethnically diverse Europe is reverting to something that actually never really existed. Because when we go back into like, you know, actual medieval Europe history, we find out that our world was never as ethnically pure and rigidly dissected almost. You know what I mean? Segregated as we often think. And we'll put a pin into that and see where it leads us later on. Now that's one thing. We have a bunch of things thrown in, like we have a Church of Rome, which is like pseudo-Catholic, but apparently also kind of weird because the Pope is female, which, why not? I don't care. We have some mutants thrown in, which is fun. We have some technology thrown in, which is really fun. It's nothing new. I mean, we've had the idea of post-apocalyptic Earth being a fantasy setting, well, at least since 1977, when Shay Omford had to duck from a mechanical centipede on his way to totally not Moria, where the totally not Gandalf druid died in Sword of Shannara. Which, incidentally, was one of the coolest things about Sword of Shannara, is that point when you realize that, yeah, this is actually far future and not a different world kind of fantasy thing. So props for that to Terry Brooks. Not that he's the first one who play with that idea, but he's probably the first one who drags it into large epic fantasy novels. So there's that. Neat. We have one trip to the rest of the world. It's extremely Eurocentric, not only in the story that is told, but also in the way that other countries are described. There is North Africa, or Afrique, which is a wonderful cliche of Orientalism with every racist stereotype you can imagine. Like cities are warm and smelly and full of urchins that try to steal, and everyone is sitting in coffee houses drinking coffee or tea and playing backgammon, and I don't know. And out there in far China and Japan, which are called Nippon and Ling, everyone is all about torture and despotism and weird exoticism. And I'm if you would make that the thing that people in, the West believe, that's fine, but the person telling us that stuff is actually a refugee from there. So there we are. And that's a problem overall, because what we get here is basically Mark Lawrence going you know what? I want a sort of medieval setting, but I also want a twist in it, and that's technology. So I'll make it post-apocalyptic, but I can't be arsed to actually come up with a convincing backstory and how we return to that. I'll just drop all of it in here and put cool things in with no explanation so they look cool. And we'll return to that look cool part in a bit. The next part, the story and the editing and the plotting. Because once again, we see something here that I think is vital. And that is, the story follows Jorg Ankrath, who is very much an anti-hero. Not even that, he's an asshole. He's a massive dickhead. We follow his rise to power, how he, murders and pillages his way through his father's kingdom and his uncle's kingdom, takes it over, becomes king in his own right there, then, goes on, all the way until the point where he becomes Emperor of the Broken Empire again. And that's, a solid plot line, and it's fine. The way it's structured is actually really cool, because at the same time we get, all kinds of flashbacks where we explore the nature of Jorg Ankrath's character, why he is the arsehole that he is, how he is a very damaged person that has all this trauma to live through, and how that may or may not explain, if not excuse, some of his actions. And that's, I think, a very cool idea. It's an ambitious idea for a debut novel or a debut trilogy. And overall, structurally, Mark Lawrence is doing really well with that. We have in all three books, we have these aspects, we have flashbacks that explain events that will then make the actual climax of the story each time work, and so forth. It's not new. It's something that we have seen before in a lot of novels with characters having these flashbacks. In sci-fi, I guess Chasm City by Alistair Reynolds is a really good example in, younger days, not super old stuff. But, that's solid, and that's really cool, and he mostly handles that fairly well. Especially in King of Thorns, we have a wonderful device where Jorg Ankrath does something or thinks he does something. Well, he does something, and is so traumatized by what he did in that situation that his memories are magically taken away and put into a box that he's carrying around with him. And then through time, whenever that box accidentally opens up, some of these memories spill out, and that's sort of the mechanism we have to have those flashbacks. And that's clever. That's really cool. That's neat. I like that. It's flashy, but it's good. My issues are others. There are elements in there that feel weird and feel not fully thought through. One of them is, in the entirety of book 1, Jorg Ankrath is hating the Duke of Raynor. And in the second to last chapter, we find out that the Duke of Raynor is, in fact, his uncle, who had his mother murdered and his brother killed. And, fine. I don't mind. The question, however, is why do you only mention that in the second to last chapter? Shouldn't you, hint at that family relation thing a bit more? Because I know where you're going with this. It's medieval Europe. All the nobility is married to each other. Everyone is a bit of Habsburg somewhere. Just look at their chins, right? I get it, but to just pull it out of your arse at the second to last moment is more did you just think of that all the way back and then couldn't go back and re-edit it in some way? Which is where we come to the point that these books are not too well edited, and I feel like a good development editor would really help with this. But I can't actually blame anyone here, because these are debut novels, and I don't think big publishing houses spend a shit ton of money on that kind of stuff for new authors. So correct me if I'm wrong, but there's things that I, as an editor, and I hope other editors would probably go back to and say, should probably do something with that. Another aspect is that for 2 out of 3 books, it plays a huge role that Jorg and some of the other players, or not players, but some of the other kings in that 100 War are in fact played by the Hidden Ones. The Hidden Ones are apparently a group of slightly weird, inhuman, magic-using kind of people that invade dreams or in other ways compel, move around and whatnot, those official rulers of those kingdoms for some reason that is not really clear, but apparently they're doing that. And then in book 3, it doesn't really matter at all, because they're still there, but then the conflict is an entirely different one. And there's 2 or 3 issues with that. Issue 1 is, if they play a huge role, then they should actually have some impact on the final conflict, and not just drop out of sight at near the end. Because you spend a lot of time talking about the Hidden Ones and their agendas and shit like that for 2 books, and then suddenly they're they just literally stand by, because near the end someone shows up with 2 of those Hidden Ones in tow, and they're just goes nowhere. And that's bad editing once again. You should make sure that they have some specific role to play, whether it is and they're built up as something of an antagonist, so maybe there's a situation where they can do something with that. It could have been made clearer, is what I'm saying. The other aspect is that I personally think that having a large part of your world building be there's a power behind the scenes that is secretly moving pieces and playing with humanity for a hidden agenda is something that you might not want to make a core concept of your world, because that is a slippery slope that leads past our East Coast financial elites into real, conspiracy theories that can and will be structurally and finally really anti-Semitic. So maybe don't do that unless you're actually making something really useful out of it, which we don't get here. As I said, it's a wasted idea because it goes nowhere after book 2. So why do that? Third case in point, the actual main conflict is between Jorg and his brother William, who dies at the beginning of the whole traumatic thing, and then claws his way back from the realms of the dead as the dead king to take over the empire out of a feeling of, out of a mixed feeling of like revenge and loss because he feels like his brother Jorg abandoned him, and also a feeling of entitlement that he actually deserves the crown. On the other hand, in book 3, we have a lot of flashbacks of Jorg getting told by everyone that it should have been him who died in that whole situation at the beginning. It should have been him and not William, because William was stronger, better, and all those things in every regard, while William being the younger boy. And you know what? I like the idea. I like the idea of having a story about a sibling rivalry and the toxic influence that family can have on that kind of sibling rivalry, that the influence that parents like fucking over their children can have. I like all of that. But that idea that Jorg was told that it should have been him who died and William was better and all of that shows up only in book 3 out of 3. And if that is your main conflict, and it explains why Jorg is the way he is and why he tries so ultra hard and all of that stuff, maybe mention it once or twice in earlier books. I mean, there's one scene that I can't fully remember that may have been in book 2, where Jorg talks to his, in a flashback scene where Jorg talks to his grandmother. Maybe that's in book 2 or in book 3. I'm not quite sure about that right now, and I can't look it up right now, of course. But point is, I like the idea, but it feels like Lawrence is kind of fumbling it in that situation, because it could have been so much better handled if you have like a continuous development there, not just drop it like really heavily in like every flashback scene in book 3. So we really know that it's a big deal. Just like spread it out a bit more. And that's once again something where I feel like an editor, like looking at the entire series, at the entire trilogy at once, could have really helped, spread out these things, make it more even in a lot of ways. And that didn't happen. Part 3. Prose, violence, and shock. Alright, so the prose is really cool. I like the prose. It's the kind of thing I like. It's lyrical, it's almost poetic in a lot of ways, and then it flips to really cool like quips and quotes that are great one-liners, references to pop culture, because it's the far future, and they can drop like hints to all kind of our culture if you want, and stuff like that. That is really entertaining. It's fun, it's fast, it's flashy, it's cool. Really cool. And I will read more Mark Lawrence books because he has a gift for language, and I like that in books. I really do. So, next bit, violence. There's a lot of violence in these books, and it's explicit, it's graphic, and it's brutal. It's not, in descriptions, it's not as cinematically violent as, say, the violence in Joe Abercrombie's writing. It's more like the things that happen are extremely brutal, but we don't get like every single inch of entrails described in minute detail, which, I'm fine. You find your own style, it's good. The violence descriptions are extremely over the top. The things that happen are all over the top, and they do tend to like focus on shock value. I mean, the whole book starts with the pillaging, raping, and burning of a town. That's like our first scene. And that's, it's a choice, and it fits right into that situation. So I'm fine with the violence. I don't mind it. Well done. Now let's look at the shock value and edginess in general here for a second. And that is, it feels from time to time that the book is trying real hard to stand out. And I want to do a bit of like a history thing here. So around the year 2000, 2005-ish, Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire actually had its huge breakthrough, because no one was reading that book in 96. It took a while to actually gather steam, but like the early 2000s, the idea that you can like make really flashy, brutal, gritty, violent fantasy had caught on. And what they did was, sign Joe Abercrombie, and he does his first Law trilogy, which takes a lot of like the things that George R. R. Martin does and turns them up to 11 in all kinds of ways, makes it even more cinematic, more ultra-violent, more snappy dialogue, and all of that stuff. And it was hugely successful. And then people started recognizing Scott Lynch and the Gentlemen Bastards, who take that to an entirely another level, a different level, especially the dialogue and snappiness, not so much the ultra-violence, which, is fine. And that got hugely popular and successful at the time. Everyone was like, we want book 2. And book 2 came out, and everyone was like, we want book 3. And Scott Lynch had all the mental health problems that he has, and nothing happened for a long time. And that's sort of the area, that's sort of the time into which Mark Lawrence tries to make his way into that field. And the way he chooses to do that is by taking all of these elements and turning them even further up to 11. Like, escalation is obviously a thing that you can do within every subculture to make things more extreme. It's like in music, you play faster, you play harder, you play deeper, your lyrics become more violent, more explicit, whatever. Escalation is a tool to gather attention. And Mark Lawrence certainly does that in this book. And there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that approach. So I will not challenge him on that regard at all. That's fine. I don't think it comes across as good as it should, with like some issues that, the books are supposedly told by Jorg Ankrath, and the way it is handled is that the first book was written after the events of book 1, and the second book is written after the events of book 2, and the third one is written after the events of book 3, and one of the shock value elements, the edginess elements here, is that Jorg is 14 years old when he's finishing book 1, and he has, murdered, raped, and pillaged his way over the kingdom for 4 years, and then he uses masterfully lyrical prose, and that doesn't feel believable. It doesn't feel, the plausibility suffers from the quality of the prose there, because you could make this a wonderful book about, like, the idea of child soldiers and how much mental damage that takes. That would be an interesting thing, but you can't expect them to write, like, lyrical, wonderful prose that goes more into like the Gene Wolfe direction than anything else. You can't expect that. And it kind of breaks immersion, at least for me. And that could have been solved if you take the Gene Wolfe approach of, like, say, Book of the New Sun, and just make clear that the entire story is written by, computer-simulated Jorg Ankrath after the events of book 3. When he has, like, the entire library of human literature to go back to figure out his prose, to tell his story. That would have been perfect. But Mark Lawrence doesn't do that, so it feels a bit off in that regard. So, where does that leave us with this book? It is a lot of wasted chances, a lot of lazy world building, and a lot of editing errors. It still has wonderful prose, cool fighting, cool violence, and a lot of other things like that. It is fun to read. Really fun to read. I had fun reading it. And this brings me to what we have with this book, with Scott Lynch, with Joe Abercrombie in his first Law trilogy. I'm only talking about the first one. I haven't read Age of Madness. I've only read the standalones, and they are already much better than what, Abercrombie does in the first Law trilogy. So, my point here is the Casablanca Syndrome. All right. I call it the Casablanca Syndrome because urban myth, I'm not sure if that's true, I didn't double check, but the idea is that the movie Casablanca has a lot of plot holes. What the director at the time famously said was, we'll just make it so fast that no one will notice. And that is something that is really interesting with Scott Lynch, with Joe Abercrombie, with Mark Lawrence, and a lot of that gritty, fast-paced cinematic fantasy of the early 2000s, around, all the way up to, say, 2012, 13, 14. And Mark Lawrence is sort of like the end point of that approach, I feel. And that is, we have a newfound grittiness, a newfound cinematic ultra-violence, newfound, like, really snappy, fast-paced dialogues, like, your 1990s Joss Whedon, Buffy the Vampire Slayer style of movie or TV making, in a way. And it has made its way into fantasy. And that stuff is treacherously easy to fall in love with. You read that, and if you've not read a lot of it before, you're like, wow, this is possible in fantasy. We don't need long sentences. We don't need, like, page-long descriptions of trees. We can have, like, violence and guts in our face all over the place, and really cool, snappy, over-the-top, edgy dialogue. It's awesome, and you fall in love with that, and you fall in love with it really fast. And then you don't think about like all the implications of the world building. You don't think about the plot holes. You don't think about all of these aspects. And that's a bit of a shame, because those aspects are important for your world as well, because they have all kinds of implications, and you will take those ideas in anyway, and you will take that world building in anyway, and you will take all of these other stories in there, the like ugly aspects of it, like the fat shaming that is really important in this one. It's not as big in like others, but you have like a lot of like really toxic language and bits in there that you just like take in that rush of adrenaline that all these books have. You just like take all of that in, and it feeds back into your, or my, or you know, anyone's, the reader's like general like flow of understanding of expressing yourself. That's what happens in that regard. And I think up to, you know, larger or smaller degrees, all three of those authors, and possibly more of the time, are, you know, guilty or like fall into that trap of just going so fast that all the ugly bits, the bad bits, the missing bits are just like dragged in the background and take root like in our consciousness, in our brains, without us ever realizing that we also took in that crap. And that's a problem. And that's why I think, after all, while I enjoyed reading the Broken Empire trilogy, I don't think it's a good series. It could have been great, it had a lot of potential, but maybe Mark Lawrence was not experienced enough a writer, not confident enough a writer to actually go his full-on own way in that regard, or maybe he just didn't think about it. We don't know. I'll read more of his stuff and see how he developed over time, because the potential is really there. But maybe we should actually be more critical when talking about those, you know, protégés of gritty, edgy fantasy like Joe Abercrombie, Scott Lynch, or Mark Lawrence. And I'm sure there's more. We will see. I hope you like this. I'll see you in the next one. I have no idea what it will be about, but it'll certainly be angry. So anyway, have a great day, and I'll see you. Cheers.